Welcome to After the Homily with Father Daniel Schiedt, and I'm Dr. Chris Stroud. Have you ever had questions after the homily? I know that I do. Have you ever wondered why Father talked about this topic or why he didn't talk about the thing that you were certain he was going to talk about? Have you ever wished that you could sit down with your priest and just go through that long list of things that didn't quite make it in the homily? Well, this podcast is for you. We cover topics ranging from politics to literature, from church teaching to church architecture, and everything in between. And it doesn't matter if you're an everyday, a Christmas and Easter, or even if you can't remember the last time you went to Mass Catholic, this podcast is for you. Father Daniel Schiedt is the pastor at St. Vincent de Paul Catholic Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and the Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend. Father Dan, welcome back.
Great to be here, Chris.
It's good to actually have you back. You've been away on a well-deserved vacation of sorts.
Yes, a little pilgrimage to Italy, including Rome.
I trust that it was terrific.
It was amazing. Yeah.
Oh, outstanding.
But the best part of traveling is coming home. So I'm thrilled to be back.
I always feel like I know it's been a good vacation if I'm ready to get home.
Yes.
You're charged up and ready. And today we're talking about a wonderful topic. Today is the feast day celebrating Pope St. John Paul II. I think there's disagreement as to the proper way to say that.
Pope St. John Paul II.
Yeah, he's Pope before he's a saint.
Right.
So it's Pope St. John Paul II. Today's his feast day. And so we're going to talk about really all things John Paul II.
Yes. And to date myself in my trajectory intersecting with John Paul's, I was in 6th grade when he was elected to the papacy. And I still remember the announcement coming on the loudspeaker that he had been elected, and I knew nothing about him. I put up a little picture of him in my bedroom so I could pray for him. But I had no idea that his life would shape mine so intimately and thoroughly.
Wow. And so many people's, and generations so shaped by him. I know if our Protestant brothers and sisters are listening, they might be tempted to think, why do you guys go on and on about a pope who's no longer living? And I think it can be hard to explain to Catholics and non-Catholics alike if they're not sort of into his greatness and don't fully understand him.
Well, Jesus has friends, and he wants his friends to be friends. And so there is no other way to Jesus other than by way of his friends. Yeah. And, oh, by the way, those who have died aren't just buried in the ground, turned to dust. They're alive in Christ.
Wow.
So when St. Paul would say to the Colossians in the 3rd chapter of his letter, your lives are hidden with Christ in God, and when Christ your life appears, you too will appear with him in glory. It's one of the signs of the Lord's fidelity that the life and graces that were given to a particular person in this life, they don't end in death, but they continue beyond death because eternal life envelops it all. And that's true not just of a given holy pope. It's true of anybody whose life is given over to Christ.
Wow. Yeah, I've heard it explained well by apologists, much more articulate than myself, that we would ask friends on earth to pray for us, and we know nothing about the disposition of their souls. Why would we not ask people that were already in heaven, especially those that were particularly holy and righteous while they were on earth? It only seems logical.
Yes. Almost invariably, people who met John Paul II had a palpable sense that here was a man of deep prayer, a man who was very close in friendship with Jesus. And I love the fact that it's in the communion of saints, visible and invisible, that the Lord reveals his goodness.
And someone, if thinking about his history, that no one thought would ever be pope, no one thought would ever be bishop, really, let alone pope. But maybe that's a good launching point, is to describe sort of what was happening in the church and the world as he was coming through that led to his ultimately being named Pope?
I suppose it is worth exploring this, if only for the fact that it needs to be told to future generations. I think those of us of a certain age kind of presuppose that, well, everybody remembers communism and then
Right.
Nazism. But to think that John Paul, who grew up as Karol Wojtyła, Charles Wojtyła in Poland, he had his early life marked by the domination of his country, first by the Nazis, and secondly by the communists. So, Germany and Russia had really overwhelmed his homeland, and yet he came from a deeply Catholic family, and the fact that he was cut off in many ways from the wider world because of those struggles,
Right.
I think it both allowed and prompted him to go deeper. And so his, for example, because the communists forbade more recent literature, John Paul had to rely more on the classics of the spiritual tradition. And so he was able to read like enormous portions of the fathers of the church, St. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, and he wound up getting a richer formation than he would have received had he just been reading the books of the day.
I mean, it's almost, I think it is impossible to imagine. There's a lot of terrible things going on in the world now. There's wars on many fronts. But to be a young person in Poland when John Paul was growing up, they were oppressed by multiple countries, as you point out. That's in their DNA almost as Polish people.
Yes. And the fact that he had to work in a salt mine, or a rock quarry, rather,
Right.
a rock quarry. And he knew what physical labor was, and he also knew the primacy of prayer and the fact that the faith couldn't be taken for granted. So his seminary studies were largely underground,
Secretive, yeah.
And after he was ordained a priest, his first mass was in the crypt of Wawel Cathedral in Krakow. The Nazis had closed the church, but there was an old Monsignor who was the caretaker who let this young priest in, and his first mass was celebrating the holy sacrifice of the Mass in the midst of the tombs of the kings and queens of Poland. And so just he was surrounded by history and the witness of real heroism that accepted rising to the occasion that we've been made for this moment. But to think that all took place in secret. So the Nazi flag is flying outside of the cathedral because the chancery had been made into a headquarters of the Nazis. And just in the heart of this cathedral church, the future, not only of the church, but of the world is passing by way of this young priest's first offering of the Eucharist.
Yeah. Holy our Lord.
Yes.
Is it worth pointing out, perhaps, why is there such an incompatibility between ways of communism and the church? Because it lived out there in Poland. But why are those two incompatible?
Well, in a certain way, communism aspires to be like the church without the church. In other words, a kind of equality of sharing that doesn't have God as the source and guarantor. And so what happens is that the dignity of individual human beings gets forgotten. People just become cogs in a machine. And in atheistic materialism, everything is just governed by brute economic forces. And significantly, when John Paul was elected to the papacy, one of his first encyclicals, that's a letter circulated around the church, similar to the way St. Paul would write letters to be circulated among the various churches of the Roman Empire. He wrote it on the dignity of human work. So his encyclical Laborum Exercens, it underlined the fact that work has a dignity not simply in terms of what it produces, but actually for what is being accomplished in the person working. So he recovers the vision of Genesis in which Adam and Eve are tending the garden. They're given work to do before sin. So work isn't simply a curse. It's not simply a necessary duty. It's a way of participating in the very creative activity of God. And insofar as it is that, it's intrinsically noble and deserves respect. So the church's whole social teaching about how human beings by their nature deserve to have the opportunity for good work, the church is what safeguards that and promotes it. Whereas in the spoils system of communism, the joke is we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us, and everybody's unhappy. And yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it's remarkable that coming from where work had different meanings, more like slave labor in a communist country, he talks about the dignity of work, which I'm sure at the time that must have been a bizarre sort of juxtaposition of ideas.
Yes. And in the other social encyclicals that he'll write, he further develops how the market system actually needs to keep being shaped and humanized from within. Government has a role in that, but government is no substitute for the free action and collaboration of actual workers to produce actual good things.
I mean, a non-religious person listening to that would not necessarily think that statement came from a pope, or that idea came from a pope.
Right. And human beings left to themselves do not come up with happy economic arrangements. Instinctively, in our woundedness, it becomes exploitative very quickly.
Wow. Now, you used an interesting word, elected pope. We're in the midst of a national election. We did a few episodes on discerning how
we did.
We did. And voting has already begun as we make this recording. But we say the Pope was elected, it just sounds odd to me when we're thinking about secular elections. But maybe a little bit about why we say elected and how that works.
Sure. So historically, the successors of St. Peter were chosen at first from among the local clergy of the city of Rome, and that discernment was made by the clergy of that local church. As history developed, and as the church expands in scope to be truly universal in its reach around the world, the Pope's closest advisors, called cardinals, upon the death or abdication of a Pope, gather in conclave. The word conclave literally means with the key, under locked doors, to ask the Lord's guidance for who should succeed the last pope. And in the case of Karl Wojtyła, coming from a communist-dominated country, interestingly enough, Karl Wojtyła was, in a sense, allowed to become a bishop by the communists because they thought he was just a dreamy poet.
A pacifist.
They really didn't think of him as a political threat. He wasn't seen as a kind of mover and shaker interested in worldly power. So they kind of just tolerated him, being consecrated as a bishop. But then when it came time for his election, the cardinals who came to the conclave in October of 1978 were still in shock over the death of Pope John Paul I,
Right.
who famously reigned for only 28 days before dying. And there are all sorts of stories that have circulated about how some people thought Karl Wojtyła should have been elected when John Paul I was.
Sure.
Other people who've concluded that John Paul I needed to be a kind of bridge. But in any case, the cardinals were quite chastened by having to gather again after just a few weeks, and the one who emerged beyond whatever factions was this non-Italian for the first time in centuries.
But not right away, correct? Doesn't the story go there were several votes, they couldn't come up with an individual, and eventually he sort of emerged, surprisingly.
Yes. So, and that can and does happen at various elections. So there will be a candidate who seems to be favored, perhaps favored even by the previous pope. And in a certain way, that has its own logic to it, because in running an institution as large as the church, one does actually need training for that. So in the case of Pope Paul VI, for example, he was actually very close with Pope John the 23rd, even with Pope Pius XII before him. And so he was an obvious candidate, to be made pope. Whereas in the case of John Paul II, the fact that he wasn't Italian, the fact that he's coming from a communist country.
He's very young as well.
Very young, 58 years old, which just astounds me. I'm 55 years old and just 3 years away from how old Karl Wojtyła was when he was elected pope. In any case. But people knew him as a man of deep prayer. He advised Paul VI on the encyclical Humanae Vitae, reaffirming the church's teaching on the transmission of human life. And so in that sense, he was a known quantity, but and there was a real sense of destiny when he was elected.
I think a lot of us, just wonder. It's the stuff of which movies, bad ones, I guess, are made sometimes. But a room full of cardinals, and they're saying, I don't know, you want to be pope? I don't want to be pope. But presumably they're taking this to God in prayer and saying, who do you want to be the head of your church on earth? And they're to discern the right thing.
Yes. And obviously there are going to be varying degrees of docility to the Holy Spirit. And so, some of the popes over the church's history are more of a demonstration of the Lord's permissive will rather than his dispositive will. In other words, the Lord accepts human decisions, especially in that period of the church's history in which the popes had to be civil rulers as well. So we tend to take for granted that, the pope is the spiritual leader of the church. But for the centuries between the conversion of the Emperor Constantine, around 312, all the way to the Lateran Treaty of 1929, the popes were in a difficult position of either having to wield worldly power to defend the so-called papal states, what's now central Italy, and that meant having a standing army, raising taxes, or they could place themselves under the care, patronage of the most powerful worldly ruler, whether it's the King of Spain, King of France, with all of the worldly influence that goes with that. In the case of John Paul being elected, the Pope doesn't have to worry about being a worldly ruler. Thanks to the Lateran Treaty of 1929, he just has the little postage stamp size Vatican City state. So it is a state. It's not, doesn't belong to anybody else, including Italy. But it's not large enough for anybody to care about. So you don't need standing army. I mean, the Swiss Guard are the Pope's bodyguard, but you don't need missiles. You don't need to collect taxes from enormous numbers of people. And so John Paul was able to come before the world as a true shepherd who had really suffered and whose suffering gave him an intimacy with the Lord Jesus Christ that allowed him to say famously, unforgettably, quoting the Lord himself, "Be not afraid."
Oh, that's beautiful. When do you think it became, maybe not clear, but apparent to the world that this isn't John the First, this isn't John the 23rd, this man is something different?
I think immediately. And some wanted to dismiss him as coming from a backward part of the world, not being as cultured, perhaps.
It's hard to imagine now. But...
Yeah, as somebody from a Western, it's, the typical Western arrogance. But they realized very quickly that this is a man of deep prayer, of deep learning, and of great intelligence and vigor, all applied to furthering Christ being known and loved. And I have to say, if you'd permit me, the first paragraph of the first encyclical letter that he writes, and he chooses as his topic Redemptor Hominis, the Redeemer of man. So the first reference point for his papacy is Jesus Christ himself. So now imagine, it's 1978. The Second Vatican Council had just concluded, 1965, and the fallout of that, there was all sorts of chaos. So imagine the late 60s, you have the war in Vietnam, the protests associated with that, the sexual revolution. You have tens of thousands of priests, consecrated religious, abandoning their vows. The church is in free fall. And
do you feel like that was more so in the United States, or is that worldwide?
Around the world.
Yeah,
around the world. And into that steps this Polish churchman. And so the first paragraph of his encyclical Redeemer of Man reads this way: "The Redeemer of man, Jesus Christ, is the center of the universe and of history. To him go my thoughts and my heart in this solemn moment of the world that the church and the whole family of present-day humanity are now living." So the first thought, to Christ. "In fact, this time, in which God in his hidden design is entrusted to me, after my beloved predecessor, John Paul I, the universal service connected with the chair of St. Peter in Rome is already very close to the year 2000. Dr. Christopher Stroud, who in 1978, amidst all of this turmoil, who else is thinking about the year 2000.
That must have sounded so strange at
My
the time.
goodness. And he goes on. At this moment, it's difficult to say what mark that year will leave on the face of human history, or what it will bring to each people, nation, country, and continent, in spite of the efforts already being made to foresee some events approaching that date. For the church, the people of God, spread, though unevenly, to the most distant limits of the earth, it will be a year of great jubilee. We're already approaching that date, which will recall and reawaken in us in a special way our awareness of the key truth of faith, which St. John expressed at the beginning of his gospel. Quote, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us," unquote. And elsewhere, quote, "God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life," unquote. We are also, in a certain way, in a season of a new Advent, a season of expectation.
It sounds so optimistic.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
And actually more than optimistic, hopeful.
Oh,
So
yeah.
he's proposing something beyond just putting Band-Aids on the wounds. He's proposing the divine healer of history himself, the Lord Jesus Christ. And then you look over the course of his papacy, 1978 to 2005, so 27 years, and you just marvel at how all of the encyclical letters, like all of the teaching, just builds one on the other into a coherent whole. And that in itself is a mark of his greatness.
Wow.
But then you add to that how his papacy was a leaven in world history, in the political realm, in the catalyzing the fall of communism, and that's where one approaches the title that is given to a few of the popes, Pope Leo the First, Pope Gregory the First, the title Great. So when a pope's influence, even in the wider world, takes on a kind of world historical importance, it's a revelation of the greatness of God alive at the heart of the church.
It's so amazing. I mean, I know you, so I came prepared to think about books. And one of my favorite books is A Pope and a President by Paul, I think it's Kengor, I believe is the pronunciation of his name. And I think someone gave me this book. I don't remember choosing it for myself. But what I was so taken with immediately in the book was as you already spoke to, the incompatibility between a Christ-centered life and communism. And it was clear his willingness to do battle with the evil that was the Nazis without fear, it seemed. And then that connected him with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And it would seem, in reading history, he really played a pivotal role in tearing down, that enterprise that had been so evil and destroyed Poland so many times.
Yes.
But that was his sort of loving revenge, it almost seems.
And when one thinks of the papal diplomatic corps, so the popes have had diplomats assigned to governments on the face of the earth longer than any government currently in existence. So the church has been sending out diplomats virtually from the beginning. And so John Paul, receiving all of this feedback from countries around the world, was in a very privileged position to be collaborating in the advancement of a project that would lead to the fall of governmental systems that, in seeking to be the church without the church, or to play God without God, were actually dehumanizing people. And when John Paul visited Poland for the first time, it was just electric. And the communist leadership knew when this happened.
This is bad.
It was game over, and it was just a matter of time.
It must have been so exciting. And then when I think about coming into the church in 2006 and maybe thinking about it in 2005, as an outsider, what I remember knowing about John Paul, his travel, the non-Catholic world, he was everywhere. He was always on the news. He was in a different country, it seemed, all of the time. And yet, as you said, he was thought to be sort of backward, maybe not so sophisticated. And yet his worldwide diplomacy, there's few leaders that he didn't meet with.
Yes. And of course, at his funeral, it was just astonishing because the world came to him. Yeah. You just think, what other person on the planet would have even secular rulers from all over the place? And significantly, Russia didn't send anyone.
And that was said to be one of his greatest,
it was an agony for him.
Right, he really never made it to Russia.
Yeah, they wouldn't let him. But for me, a cradle Catholic, some of the moments that moved me the most, when I was at Notre Dame as an undergraduate, there was a professor of mine, Mikhail Waldstein, who was one of the theological experts working on the new catechism. And so we live at a moment now where there's talk of synodality, just wide consultation of the laity, collaborating with the bishops. And I saw this with my own eyes being lived in the papacy of John Paul II, because John Paul asked for a universal catechism to consolidate the teaching of the Second Vatican Council and present it as an organic whole to the church. And there were all sorts of people, so this was in the mid-'80s, saying, you can't do that. The faith is just too complex, and the modern world is so complex. There hadn't been a universal catechism since the end of the Council of Trent. And John Paul was not intimidated. And so he consulted with the whole worldwide episcopate.
Wow.
And set up the appropriate committees. And then the different parts of the catechism were, so to speak, farmed out to different people. And then the different drafts were circulated with all sorts of experts. So picture this as a visual. I'm an undergrad. This is probably 1988, 89. I go in the office of my professor, and there is a stack of little sheets of paper, probably, 6 by 6 length and width. And the stack is I would guess, 3 feet high. And each one of those pieces of paper was a suggested emendation to the little portion of the catechism that Mikhail was working on. And it was on divine revelation. And Mikhail had to sort through those. Oh, and actually, he's responsible for the addition at the beginning of the catechism of the books of the Old and New Testament as being listed there. And I just thought, what a collaboration to think that a single book could be produced by really the whole episcopate. Then after I graduated, I studied at a place called the Casa Balthasar in Rome, set up by then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. And as it happened, the Universal Catechism was edited in the home where I was living. Wow. By the future Cardinal Christoph Schönborn. So again, I saw firsthand the collegiality, the collaboration, the drawing on just wisdom from the great tradition, theological expertise from around the world. And I got to be the lector at St. Mary Major on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, 1992, when the catechism was promulgated.
Oh, my.
So, I got to be, feet away from the successor of Peter as this great gift this great teaching tool, is given to the church. So whenever I think of synodality, I go back to that moment that has borne such good fruit in the life of the church and has just educated generations of people to come into their own.
And that says so much about his, I don't know if confidence is the right word, but to put that out there like that, it would be tempting for a leader, an executive, to hold that very close and to not allow that kind of input from people all over the world in different views.
Yeah, and you can be assured that he went through the final draft with a fine-tooth comb, but that he actually trusted his collaborators.
And sought that.
Exactly. And the fact that he surrounded himself at his meals, at
that's
the
in my
masses
book.
that he would celebrate, like with other people. Yeah.
George Weigel's book, Witness to Hope. That's my other plug.
Oh, sure. Classic.
I love reading about that. I mean, it's a book about writing a book. But he goes into some of the, getting a phone call saying the Holy Father would like you for lunch in an hour and jumping on the private elevator and heading up to his apartment. But his lunches were apparently famously, I hate to say argumentative, but spirited debate.
Yes.
But he didn't surround himself people that would just say yes to him all the time. That's a courageous leader.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It sounded amazing to be part of
And the fact that he would set up whole institutions to be essentially think tanks for the church's teaching in the world, and also to form future generations. So most people don't make this connection, but on the very day that he was shot in St. Peter's Square, Feast of Our Lady of Fatima, he had just signed beforehand the charter for the John Paul II Institutes for the Study of Marriage and Family. And as he famously said, the salvation of the world passes by way of the family. And so the fact that the establishment of this institution to serve the family and his own personal suffering of having the evil of the world, like literally pierce his body.
Right.
It was that integrity of life that made him so convincing. It was the power of the truth combined with the power of suffering that was really radiant.
I mean, something else, you remind me saying that he's so famous for, I think it's fair to say, is sort of the recapturing of a youthful generation. I mean, I have to wonder how many young priests today are priests because they encountered his writings, his teachings.
Absolutely.
But what was it that was so magical about him? Sure, he started World Youth Day, but what was it that allowed him to speak so perfectly to young people like no one before him?
I actually think early on in his life, he allowed the Lord from the beginning to take the fullness of his humanity, to take it, bless it, break it open, and give it. So the fact that he would love going on long hiking trips,
ski trips,
canoeing, rafting, canoeing with young people, especially college age young couples, and then having that human context be the place where they would talk about the things of God and what it is to belong to the church. That loving of human love with the love of God, I think, is what allowed him to have the influence that he had. And in many, many of his encyclicals, there's a passage from a document of the Second Vatican Council called Gaudium et Spes, Joy and Hope, that John Paul just quoted over and over again. It's from the 22nd chapter of Gaudium et Spes. Quote, "The truth is that only in the mystery of the incarnate Word does the mystery of man take on light. For Adam, the first man, was a type of him who was to come, Christ the Lord. Christ, the new Adam, in the very revelation of the mystery of the Father and of his love, fully reveals man to himself and brings to light his most high calling, unquote. And so rather than taking a trajectory of a kind of angelism, of kind of over-spiritualizing the spiritual life, John Paul took seriously the incarnation, that it's precisely because the Word has become flesh, of my flesh, and dwells among us, that I can take my humanity seriously. And I have to take the humanity of other people seriously. He also said, man can only find himself in making a sincere gift of himself. So just that Trinitarian logic that the Father is the Father in relation to the Son is the Son in relation to the Father, and the Holy Spirit, that bond of love, reveals that our humanity is intrinsically relational. We are not fundamentally isolated individuals.
Do you think by today's standards, I guess, he would be called a traditionalist, or does that even apply to his sort of new way of thinking?
Yeah, I think the more appropriate epithet would be radical.
Yeah.
To paraphrase G.K. Chesterton, the Catholic journalist, he out-conserved the conservatives and out-liberaled the liberals.
Right.
And the fact that he could dialogue with people of such different backgrounds is a testament to the fact that he's actually interested in what's fully human. It's the opposite of an ideologue, where I'm only interested in you insofar as you agree with me, and if you don't,
I'll discourage you. Yeah. And I've heard it said that one of the reasons he may have been so popular with young people was his authenticity. And it's often said of the current moment that there are those who would sort of dumb down the faith and make it a little more worldly and make it a little easier and not quite so harsh. But by all rights, it doesn't sound like that was his approach. It was the truth, but the truth in love.
Yes.
But he never changed the truth for convenience, did he?
Correct. Yeah, and so his Wednesday audiences, so crowds would come to Rome and the Pope would teach them. When John Paul II came to the Sistine Chapel before being elected Pope, he was carrying a manuscript with him. So if you can just, again, just set the scene, it's 1978, height of the sexual revolution. You're just like all of the churning, disobedience and the rot in the church. And he's under Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling with the first chapters of Genesis, the creation of man and woman being illustrated above him, Michelangelo's fresco at the end of the chapel of the Last Judgment before him. And he's holding the manuscript about human love and the nature of human sexual difference and what it has to do with the family, the transmission of children. And at that moment, when he's elected Pope, rather than put the manuscript aside, he just starts delivering it every Wednesday, piecemeal, and it became known as the theology of the body.
Right.
And so rather than trying to cut people a better deal on secular terms, he's actually proposing the Creator's plan for man and woman and the implications of that in a very non-moralistic way, in a way that is philosophically, theologically, spiritually rich. And it's
really
borne such good fruit.
independent of cultural norms.
Correct.
To a degree, but that sounds sort of radical sitting here in 2024. I can't imagine how that sounded in the midst of the so-called sexual revolution. And
Yeah, I mean, the fact that he's actually proposing health rather than putting Band-Aids over disease. And it was his own fidelity to his own vocation that gave people the courage to be faithful to theirs. And the fact that he continued, even in the midst of such great suffering, to be faithful to his ministry was deeply inspirational.
I think that's the other thing that really left an impression on me as a converting Catholic was this idea of the dignity of suffering and watching the videos of him as he physically deteriorated.
Yes.
But it didn't seem to, he seemed to have no desire to hide that. Just the opposite, that he sort of wanted people to see that
Yes.
I'm suffering, I'm infirmed.
Yes. And even before old age, after he survived the assassination attempt and forgave his attacker, he wrote a letter called Salvifici Doloris, the meaning of human suffering. And that has provided consolation to innumerable people. And there's a passage that he wrote later in life where he says that when he was a young priest, sick people intimidated him. But then he said, I came to the realization that sick people evoke mercy and that they create spaces for mercy. And so John Paul then was drawn more and more to the sick, and he would entrust his intentions to the sick people to pray for. And he said the results were always positive. But that's also formed my priesthood, that the sick evoke mercy and they create spaces for mercy.
Wow.
Like there's more love brought into the world because of the compassionate response that the sick evoke than would have existed, again, if we were able to control things on our own terms.
Wow. And I believe you had a chance to meet John Paul, didn't you?
I met him twice,
Wow.
once as a seminarian and once as a priest.
What was that like?
It was amazing. And first of all, that we would be welcomed into the intimacy of his chapel. So every morning he would offer Mass for about 30 people. And the people we were traveling with from the seminary were able to arrange the meeting. And then he loved to meet with young priests, religious. And the second time I met him, he was quite infirm. But to be in the presence of somebody who had clearly fought the good fight and was somebody that understood what it is to belong to the Lord so deeply. It was profoundly moving.
It had to be affirming, for lack of a better term, for your pursuit of the priesthood. I couldn't imagine that it wouldn't be.
Absolutely. And to be so intimately associated with his teaching ministry, as I mentioned, with the Universal Catechism,
Sure.
I had a special gratitude for what he was undertaking, because he, in a sense, he wasn't intimidated by the professional establishment of talking heads and the credentialed. He just kind of spoke over them to ordinary people, and ordinary people got it. And so he formed a whole generation of teachers and catechists. So in addition to priests, consecrated religious,
Sure.
he just formed a generation of just good marriages and good people dedicating themselves to the service of the church for the life of the world. And yeah, he really served the communion of saints in that respect.
That's quite a legacy. Do you have a favorite John Paul II textbook source?
George Weigel's book really is magisterial, the 2-volume work.
The biography, yeah.
Yeah. But for those people who are looking for an off-the-beaten path John Paul book that might not be as well known, there's a book by one of the priests who served as his personal secretary. And I don't know the name of the priest offhand, but the title of the book is He Loved Tuesdays Best.
Oh.
So Tuesday was the day that John Paul would take for special rest.
Oh.
And it's just a delightful book of anecdotes.
Oh.
Anecdotes. I also have to say, for me, his plays, reading the plays that he wrote, were also very influential in my life.
Wow.
And if people haven't seen the dramatization of one of the plays, perhaps his most famous, The Jeweler's Shop, that would be a great evening to spend with people you love. The Jeweler's Shop.
Wow. Well, I think I have this quote that I love from John Paul that maybe it's a fitting end to our discussion, and it's this: there is no evil to be faced that Christ does not face with us. There is no enemy that Christ has not already conquered. There is no cross to bear that Christ has not already borne for us and does not now bear with us.
Oh, it's so beautiful.
Yeah, it's so comforting. I feel like he's sitting here.
And for me, my final thought is when he was canonized, his body was taken from the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica and brought upstairs and placed under an altar. And I've been able a number of times to celebrate Mass over his body on that altar. And it overwhelms me every time to think that this man who was given the mission by Christ as the successor of Peter to be, for our times, the rock on which Jesus would build the church. The fact that he's now literally part of the architecture of St. Peter's Basilica, for me, it brings out the radiant truth of the first letter of St. Peter, where it speaks of being built up as living stones, each one of us fitted into the temple of God. And maybe just one more, I can't resist my last story. If you do a Google search of John Paul II baptismal certificate or Karl Wojtyła baptismal certificate, you'll see the entry in the book of his home parish. So you can go to Wadowice, Poland, to the church where he was baptized. All of his encyclical letters are commemorated in fresco on the ceiling, so it's gorgeous. But in that church register, it's listed the date when Karl Wojtyła was baptized, his first communion, confirmed, ordained a priest, consecrated a bishop. And then they have to fit more and more in as things happen. And so, like, named cardinal, elected pope, dies, beatified, canonized, and then they're done. And if you go to Wadowice, you can also go to his home, his childhood home, which has been turned into a museum. And the intimacy of just being brought into an ordinary home of an ordinary man, chosen by Christ to be a shepherd, and for his home to be as large as the church and his home to be as great as heaven. It's just beautiful that we're included in this with such a good friend, such a good father.
That it is. Well, thank you. Well, viewers, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode as much as we've enjoyed bringing it to you. We hope that you've been touched by some of the stories of this great man known as Saint Pope John Paul II. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear the ways that you've been moved by this great man and your thoughts about this episode. We'd love to know if you have ideas for future episodes. You can reach us directly at church@stv.org. If you'd like, you can message me directly, 260-450-8878. If you would, put after the homily in the subject line. But please like and share and subscribe this podcast. Share it with everyone you know. If you want to follow Father Dan's challenge, this would be a great way to reach out to those 12 people nearest you or the 60 people nearest you. If you want to keep that challenge going, what a great way to introduce them to the faith by sharing, hopefully, this podcast with them. Again, thank you for joining us on this episode, and we'll be back soon with another episode of After the Homily with Father Daniel Schiedt.